A 17-year-old French Algerian is shot dead. The police officer is in custody, accused of his murder. The violent unrest across France that followed the shooting hints at issues that go well beyond just this one incident. So why is France such a hotbed of civil unrest? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. France is no stranger to turmoil on its streets, but the Paris shooting of a teenager is not about the class issues of the Gilets jaunes. Many believe this wave of violence is the consequence of a system which is embedded with racism.
17-year-old Nahel was a takeaway delivery driver and a rugby player. Raised in the Parisian suburb of Nanterre, he was shot dead by police on June 27th at the wheel of a car, one he wasn't legally allowed to drive. Known to police but never convicted of any offence, his death sparked fury, first on the streets of Paris and then across the country. Much of that anger from teenagers like Nahel, furious at what they see as the constant prejudice shown to ethnic minorities in France. Even the UN has accused France's security forces of systemic racism, a claim flatly denied by the Secretary General of one of the country's police trade unions. President Emmanuel Macron, who described the shooting as inexplicable, called crisis meetings as the trouble spread, but Senate elections are ahead and this is a major headache for his government. So, is France simply in denial about racism and the treatment of ethnic communities?
So let's meet our guests. Joining me in the studio, we have Jonathan Miller, who's the Spectator's correspondent in France. Meanwhile, in Paris, we have Nabila Ramdani, who is a French Algerian journalist and author of Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. And in Paris as well, we have Alexis Poulain, who is founder of Le Monde Moderne Média. Let's bring it across and start, if I can, in the studio. And I think the first question I have to ask you is, normally when we see a set of protests in France, they sort of go on for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then they peter out, and then the next series of rows and protests seems to come along. We've just had, for instance, the pension protests. This time feels different, though.
I think it's been an exceptionally violent period. And what it tells us is that France has still failed to fix a very fundamental problem, which is that there are 8 to 10 million immigrants and children of immigrants in France who are really not part of the French dream. France has these very noble ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but for young men especially growing up in the banlieue, the suburbs that surround really every big city in France, there's very little opportunity, there's very little equality, and the fraternity they find is very often with gangs. And so it takes, this latest round of chaos was provoked by the killing of a 17-year-old boy by a policeman, and it's best to let the judicial process take its course. But I don't think these riots had a lot to do with that. I think they were an excuse for a venting of outrage, and that's what we saw. I think it's subsiding now, but I fear that France will remain vulnerable to this until it finds a durable solution to this, to how to create a more integrated society.
Well, we'll come back to that because it's important whether you think there is a solution out there. But first, let me introduce the other guests. Alexi, let me bring this across to you. What's your take on this? Because there are plenty of people that are saying, no, this unfortunate death in Paris is, of course, a spark that has kicked everything off in Paris. However, there are other people looking at it and saying, no, this is an excuse. There was always going to be some kind of riot. There was always going to be some kind of uprising or protest. And this is just being used as the spark.
Well, it's always been, the reason being a spark and this death, the victim, which is the one too much. The young Nahel was just 17, and I think that's what also was the spark to these riots. The problem with the French suburbs has been the same since about 30 years or something like that. We had a lot of different policy for the cities, for these territories. A lot of money was spent on infrastructure, on buildings, and trying to get these kids to be more integrated. But the root of the problem, I think, is integration, is the fact that some of these kids don't feel French or not enough French compared to other citizens. It's kind of a second-class citizen debate here, where the police has always been present in these suburbs. The violence was there, a sort of endemic racism as well. And so far, we had already the same riots. I mean, they were not so violent in 2005, but it was exactly the same debates we were having at the time in France. And right now, what we see is exactly the same issue and the same debate. Has France done enough for these suburbs? What about education? What about the families? And what is the future in the, le vivre ensemble, as we say in France, is living together? How French society manage with the former colonies, how French Republic manage with immigration and these kids that are French but comes from migrant parents of third or fourth generation. And this debate hasn't found a solution yet.
Alexis, so I've got to ask you, since the last time we had a set of race riots in France, and we had the president come out and say, oh, yes, we'll work harder and we'll try and integrate society better, and they come out with the usual politicians' platitudes, why hasn't something been done? What's been lacking here to sort of fix it between that and now?
Well, what was lacking, I think, was the political will, because what happened in these cities is that the politicians are trying to play the election card. So they are very easy on gangs, very easy also on communities, and they don't try to do anything apart from getting voices to get elected and re-elected. So one is really a lack of courage and political action. The other thing is that there have been many reports. The last one was in 2018 with Jean-Louis Borloo, and Emmanuel Macron said, it is a very good report, but I don't care. I have other thing to do, and it's not another report that will change the thing. So even from the top of the state, apart from saying that we spent a lot of money, which is not so true, nothing was really done. And what you said in the intro is that, of course, there is a lot of fraternity with gangs, but also with religious communities. And the states, the French state, with its laïcité and stuff like that, has been disengaging himself, and nothing has been done because so far so good, until what happened last week.
Nabila, are you in agreement with what you've heard so far?
Well, I have to agree to a certain extent and disagree to a certain extent with what has been said so far. I quite agree with the fact that there is a simple solution to all of this, which is that France abides by its noble principles, which are written in its own constitution, which is liberty, equality, fraternity for all its citizens. We are talking about French citizens who happen to be of African or indeed North African backgrounds. So it takes, as Alexis quite rightly said, the political will to just implement those noble principles that underpin the Republic, the French Republic. But I have to slightly disagree with Jonathan's analysis that there is something exceptional, or dare I say something exceptionally violent with the current round of rioting we're seeing. Let's not forget that the modern French Republic was literally built on rioting. One of the most famous revolutions in world history took place in France in 1789. And ever since then, insurrection has become the norm. There have been numerous revolutions as well as rioting. And if we look at the latest administration headed by President Emmanuel Macron alone, his entire presidency has been characterized by some of the most ferocious riots in recent years, and they range from the yellow vests disturbances to the pension riots, and now these riots which were sparked by the brutal shooting of a 17-year-old by a Paris policeman. And if we consider that the yellow vest movements it has been pretty much institutionalized. The violence has been pretty much institutionalized, meaning that big cities such as Paris were sacked pretty much every Saturday for over 2 years.
Well, let me bring you, come back to that in a second. Jonathan, I feel I have to come back across to you.
Well, I'm obviously, with your background, you have a perception of these problems which is probably far superior to my own. I would say, yes, there is a revolutionary tradition in France, but I don't really see what's happened recently as being a revolution. There's no project, there's no political project here. This was essentially a manifestation
of pent-up rage, it would appear.
Of rage, of anger, of young kids who feel absolutely...
Right, Nabila.
Yes, well, some people like Jonathan argue that the Yellow Vests had a specific demand at the beginning of their protest, and indeed, which turned into violent rioting, which was the reduction of the price of petrol and diesel. Now, amazingly, President Macron conceded within a couple of weeks alone, and yet they carry on revolutionary style by asking pretty much ranging from government by referendum to changing the constitution. And this has descended into pretty much incoherent revolutionary movement. I would actually contend that the current rioters do have an objective, and that is first and foremost an end to reactionary policing by paramilitaries. Plenty of young people I've spoken to, especially from an ethnic minority background, have told me they want to see more community policing. They want to see more policing by consensus and not by gunpoint. And of course, they want also to see an end to endemic racism in all aspects of their lives and being treated equally and as part of society. That's very important. They are basically asking for France to uphold its founding principles.
Right, Alexei, let me bring this up to you. I feel I have to bring in a quote from President Macron here at this point when he was asked, well, you're the president. What do you say about these riots that are taking place on the street? And he said the following. We've seen them, Snapchat, TikTok, and several others. They serve as places where violent gatherings have been organized, but there's also a form of mimicry of the violence, which for some young people leads them to lose touch with reality. You get the impression that for some of them, they're experiencing on the street the video games that have intoxicated them. Alexei, a little bit tone deaf of Macron, isn't it, to blame all of this on computer games and social media?
Yeah, it's completely out of touch. The UN has been issuing 2 warnings about the violence of the French police and the racism, the endemic racism within the French police forces. And the answer to this was denegation. And now what we're seeing is that Emmanuel Macron and his government are blaming video games and the parents for the violence of the kids, which is a very easy answer and completely out of touch about the reality of the complex trouble and issues that we have in these territories. The one main issue is the economy again. You can't just be the French president and accept this level of parallel economy and of mafia business in these territories. But so far, this is what is happening. You can't be a French president and accept a rate of unemployment which is higher in these territories than in the rest of France, and especially young people in France are unemployed. This is a disgrace, and nothing really important has been made apart from trying to have some fake job that are paid by taxpayers, but it's not enough. And of course, inflation. Emmanuel Macron is not the only one to blame. I think it's been the overall political class for the last years, but also the economic state of France. And so far, the answer was not up to the job. And what we've seen with the reaction, of course, is the same denegation as we used to have before.
Jonathan.
Well, obviously, Macron's censorship of the internet, which is full blown at the moment.
It's amazing the European Union hasn't screamed about it.
It has a totalitarian aspect. I'm no friend of Macron. I've been writing 8 years of articles criticizing the incapability of the French administration to address these fundamental problems. But he has a point that in America, after the killing of George Floyd, which spawned the Black Lives Matter movement, there was this simultaneous uprising right across the United States. And there's no doubt that social media played some role in it. What I'm interested in discovering is there really a solution? Throwing money at the problem clearly doesn't work. Trevor Phillips, who's a brilliant black journalist in Britain, talks about, you look at the elite in France and you just don't see faces that represent these people in these warehouse cities. And he has suggested that somebody should really go out and identify people with real promise and bring them up and get them into the École Nationale.
This is a social mobility problem, you think?
It's to create some inspiration. I have a friend who teaches in a lycée in Béziers. She's an English woman, and she teaches English in a lycée. And she has a class of 30 students. And sadly, this is tragic. She says of these 30 students, most of them are spending the lesson playing with games on their phones. There are a few kids who are engaged, who want to move forward, but who are overwhelmed by this. And she's been told by the directrice of her school, don't try and discipline these kids because you'll be attacked. So there's been a Education nationale, as it applies in these disadvantaged areas, is really failing. And it's not just a question of money, it's a question of bigger questions. I understand you've written a book about what can save France. I'm really interested in hearing your ideas, because that to me is really the fundamental question.
We'll cross it over to Nabila then. Nabila, let me bring you across into this. Macron's comments, they must have made you pretty cross, because this has got nothing to do with computer games.
Yes, indeed. I mean, he's drawing us into a parallel universe and indeed red herrings. I mean, to blame bad parenting, for example, is playing right into the class divide within French society and to the deep-seated divisions, you know. In the end, we are talking about, we heard his justice minister saying that parents who couldn't keep their children in check effectively would face a two-year prison sentence and a 30,000 euro fine. Now, if you take the example, first of all, this is not just only absurd and inflammatory, but also unworkable. If you take the example of somebody like Nahel's mother, for example, a single mother who raised her child by herself, working 12 hours a day, how could she be responsible for the alleged misconduct of her son? How can possibly, swathes of populations who already come from impoverished backgrounds be held responsible for the behavior of the children when they're off working day and night to make ends meet? And again, you've got an easy juxtaposition with well-off parents who will have all the time and money to pour into the education and indeed the livelihoods of the children. But I think the solution, or indeed the tensions, originate from a combination of factors to do with race relations, poor race relation, to do with colonization, story of the past, and indeed ghettoization. But I would contend that it's mainly to do with the reactionary police force. And the problem is that colonial-style thinking hasn't changed much since countries such as Algeria were part of the French Empire as late as the 1960s. We have an entire party in France, in the Rassemblement National, which used to be called the National Front, which was set up by fierce nationalists who objected to losing Algeria. And this is one of the reasons they remain so angry at seeing Muslim Arabs from countries such as Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia, or indeed Francophone Africa, living in the French mainland and ostensibly, on paper, being viewed as equal citizens rather than colonial subjects.
Let me bring this over to Jonathan.
One of the terrible ironies is that politically, this probably benefits Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National. And it's my belief that she will make matters worse because she has no real idea. And I've still not heard how do you fix this. One point with a parallel to public housing in the UK, is these cités are brutalist, and they dehumanize the people who live in them. And perhaps the solution is simply to demolish them and let people have little houses with gardens and have a better stake in their communities. They were built in a kind of odd ideological idea that this, as they were here in London, that somehow this, they demolished terrace houses, built these high rises, and they've been a disaster socially. And they alienate people, and there's, the community that exists, unfortunately, is controlled very largely by criminal gangs. And how do you defang them? Clearly, the method of policing being used is, you're absolutely right, it's brutal. I know policemen in France, I know politicians of the left, right, and center in France. I remember the film La Haine, which described very well what happens when you substitute a community-based policing regime with an imposition of brute force. And it creates a resentment, which is enormous. And still, what is the solution? I don't hear any of the politicians offering anything concrete.
I couldn't agree any more with you, Jonathan. I think you make a very important point here about the brutalist aspect of the architecture of those housing estates. Le Corbusier, dare I say, has a lot to answer for in that instance. If you look at the city of Nanterre, it has particular historical resonance because, of course, it was the site of shanty towns, the biggest shanty towns in France, where up to 10,000 Algerian migrant workers, they were mainly from Algeria, were parked there with no running water, no electricity. They were themselves treated like the enemy within by the forces of the state. They were branded as insurgents. They were subjected to extrajudicial killing, torture, and all sorts of violence. And crucially, this reached a climax in October 1961, when up to 300 Algerians were brutally murdered by the Paris police in central Paris. They were hanged from trees, they were killed in police stations, they were thrown off bridges in the River Seine and left to drown. The crucial point here is that no such crimes were covered for decades. No one has been brought to justice. And there is a sentiment, if you go to Nanterre or across those housing estates, that Nahel's family won't get justice done. Now, the shanty towns have developed into bleak housing estates where the descendants of those migrants workers now live. And they feel like they are also treated like second-class citizens. And this has to change. There has to be policies that bring those communities into mainstream society and give them equal opportunity.
Hold on, Nabila. Let me bring Alexei in again. Alexei, we've been talking here about some of the policing issues here. If we go to some of the police statements, they've actually described the rioters as vermin. If we would go and have a look on fundraising, various things like Kickstarter, some of the fundraising channels that there are online, my understanding is that the fund to support the police officer who did the shooting to help pay for his defense fund, it's something like raised 5 times as much money as the fund for the victim. So there seems to be an enormous disparity here, both in language and also in the response of the civilian population in France. Alexei, how do you read that from your position?
Well, what I see is that it's been main issues that the police forces are no more seen in some territories as protector of the good and the people, but as enemies. And this online cagnotte says all. Basically, the social network is used by political camp to make sure that it's growing and saying, look, we support the policeman more than the victim, the young kid who is dead. And of course, it's terrible to see this because a police force should not be seen as enemies by any citizen of a republic or any regime, really. It says that it's a big failure of the French Republic. The motto, liberty, fraternity, equality, is not existing in some territories and in the mindset of young people. And even with this, you can see that there is two countries that are facing each other and not really wanting to talk. And the main issue for Emmanuel Macron and the rest of the society is to avoid really a civil war like it could have degenerated with Black Lives Matter, for example. It could be exactly the same situation in France if nothing is done to sort of ease the relationship between police, between justice and French citizens, whoever they are.
Nabila, we're really running out of time, so you'll have to keep it tight, but I want to put it to you. You've got a platform here. You could have President Macron or one of his spokespeople watching this show. What do they do to fix this problem? How do they start from here?
Change France's mindset. It has to change its cultural mindset. It has to look at somebody like me and say, Nabila Ramdani is a French citizen, and she has equal rights to other French citizens. That's the bottom line.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having all three of you on the show today. Thank you very much for joining me, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Remember, though, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just go there and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching, and goodbye.